There's new strata legislation on the horizon in New South Wales, and if you own a unit, townhouse or villa, you might be impacted. So what are these new laws? What are the implications for strata owners? And is this something that multi-dwelling owners in other states and territories need to be keeping an eye on?
Welcome to The Elephant in the Room. This is the podcast where we love to talk about the big things in property that never usually get talked about. I'm Veronica Morgan, real estate agent, buyer's agent and buyer's agent mentor, co-host of Foxtel's Location Australia, author of Auction Ready and co-host of Your First Home Buyer Guide.
And I'm Chris Bates, mortgage broker, recently ranked number 5 in Australia out of over 18,000 brokers in the annual MPA Top 100 Mortgage Broker Awards. Before we get started, I need to let you know that nothing we say here can be taken as personal advice. We always recommend you engage the services of an appropriate and experienced professional.
We're joined today by a long-term friend of the podcast, Amanda Farmer. Amanda is a lawyer and the owner of Lawyers Chambers, a strata-focused legal practice in Sydney. She's also the host of the long-running podcast Your Strata Property, which happens to be the world's only podcast dedicated to explaining the legal complexities of strata-titled properties. It sounds a bit dry, but it isn't. It's actually one of my favourite podcasts. Now, with over 20 years' experience in the strata legal sector, Amanda is both a fellow and council member of the Australian College of Strata Lawyers. She's a founder of Women in Strata, a networking group for women working in strata management, and is an increasingly in-demand speaker and educator. So, thank you so much for joining us today, Amanda. We're really looking forward to this update. It's been a while since we've had a good chat.
Thank you, Veronica, and thank you, Chris, for welcoming me back on the show. If my podcast sounds a bit dry, then I'm going to have to jazz up that description where it's where the fun and fancy happens with apartment buildings. I don't know. We'll
there's
work on
lots
that.
of stories. There's lots of stories, and I think that's where the juice comes, actually, the stories, the life, you know.
So what is the story here, Amanda? I have to admit, completely oblivious to even knowing this was happening. It's not something that's SMH on the front page or the AFR like to talk about it too much. So, but it's important, right? You know, we just had a client today exchange on a young couple, young family. They can't afford houses, right? It's unknown to rock you. They're going to live in an apartment. The plan's to stay in that for some time. Like, you know, most likely have multiple kids in a 2-bedroom flat. You know, so it's going to become a bigger and bigger, I don't know, part of the home buying market, and people need to be more aware of it. So keeping up to date is really important. So enlighten me. What's been announced? What's going to potentially happen? And what's happening?
Yeah. So look, it's definitely should be a big issue. We've got more than 2 million people across the country living in strata in New South Wales alone. About a quarter of us are living in apartment buildings, and that's only going to increase. In 2021, there was a wholesale review of the New South Wales legislation, and that was a review that we had to have when we had a new act come into play in 2015. We were told that within 5 years we had to review that legislation. That finally happened in 2021, and there were 139 recommendations for reform. And what we've seen now, essentially the Chris Minns government in New South Wales has pushed through about 30 of those reform recommendations, really wanting to come out with a new government on the front foot, strata, pro-strata, wanting to implement these reforms quickly. And that's what we're seeing in our 2023 strata legislation amendment bill, picking up some of those things that strata owners, that managers, that industry stakeholders were saying were real pain points for our owners, and trying to address those as quickly as possible.
Can you fill us in just in the total legislation process? So is it normal when you've got new legislation around anything, I guess, that there be a review period built into that legislation? Is that a normal thing?
I'm going to say no. I don't see it all that often. What happened in 2015 is that we had an entirely new Strata Schemes Management Act come into play in New South Wales. Lots and lots of change, a lot of new requirements, both for strata managers, the professionals who are managing these buildings, and for owners. There was a lot to get used to. There was a lot of teething to happen. And I suppose the government wants to make sure that we've got that right, and that the parts that they've got wrong, which if you read the discussion paper around the reform, there's quite a bit that they've got wrong. They want to be able to have the opportunity to fix that. And regardless of who is the government of the day, the plan in putting in what we call a statutory review is to make sure that review happens no matter what the politics is.
So then the bureaucrats get hold of that review, the 139, I think you said, recommendations in there, 30 odd have been earmarked to be put into this legislation. Does that mean the rest gets ignored, or does that get reviewed at some point?
Yeah, so we're told in the speech that was given to Parliament when this draft bill was put forward last month, we're told that this is just the beginning of a larger reform process. It's the first tranche of these reforms. And what the government wants to do is have some more public consultation early next year, 2024, and have a look at those further recommendations and see how they should be implemented into another round of reform. So it's just the beginning for New South Wales.
You say there's a bit of chatter around the reforms already in Strata world. It's probably a little not a little, but a growing community of you. But what are some of the things that they think, hang on a sec, you put these 30 on the list, but you've gone for the easy ones. You haven't gone for the big juggernauts, the things that really will turn the dial, that really need to be, in that 30 that aren't. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, so look, they've gone for the popular ones. They've gone for, I'm going to say, the easy ones. We're dealing, for example, with pets. And I think I've spoken on your show before about pets and the right of owners to be able to keep a pet in their home. So we did have new law on this a couple of years ago. What they're doing here is tweaking that law to make very clear that a building can't charge a bond or a fee to pet owners, and they can't be required to get insurance for their pet, because what happened was we had some reform a couple of years ago. It becomes much more easy to keep an animal in your home. We're seeing a lot more people apply for permission to keep their dogs and their furry friends. And what buildings were doing was seeing this as an opportunity, perhaps to make some money, charging a bond or charging hundreds and hundreds, we were hearing, hundreds of dollars in fees for your pet application. And also that was becoming a real barrier for pet owners. They didn't want to pay the bond, or they couldn't afford to pay the fee. And so the building was really getting around the legislation and finding a way to restrict pet ownership by charging these fees. So that was sort of an easy one, a popular one to tick off the list, to say, let's draft a new clause in the legislation to say that's no longer going to be allowed.
So you can't be denied. So let's say you apply for an apartment to rent it, or you apply to buy, you're buying an apartment, and you got a dog or a cat or a bird or a snake or whatever. They can't stop you moving that pet into the building.
So the law in New South Wales is that a building cannot unreasonably prohibit the keeping of an animal. And we've got a regulation that sets out in a bit more detail what unreasonable prohibitions may be. But I say as a lawyer, when I read that, the bar is set really high. And it's essentially, you can keep your snake, and you can, I make a joke that you can keep your man-eating lion as long as it doesn't eat somebody, because that's where the regulations come in. It's only addressing the impact of keeping the animal rather than the fact of keeping the animal. I mean, obviously, our local councils have restrictions on those kind of animals, but it really has broadened this opportunity for owners to keep pets in their apartments. Now, you mentioned there, Chris, tenants. In New South Wales, at least, it is still a requirement that the tenant must get the permission of the landlord in order to keep a pet, and a landlord can say no. Those laws are being tightened, as I think they have been in Victoria, where a landlord really has to find a good reason to say no to a tenant. So if you're a tenant wanting to keep a pet, chat to your landlord, and then the landlord speaks to the owners corporation and gets approval through the owners corporation. That's the strata building or the body corporate.
What else is covered in this legislation?
So we're seeing a lot of aging buildings around our country, not even just New South Wales, around our country at the moment. We've got huge weather events, climate change, flood, rain, fire. We're seeing increased construction costs. So there's this real perfect storm of events in our strata world at the moment, where it's incredibly expensive to repair and maintain our buildings. And interestingly, I think in response to that, one of the changes that is proposed is that a strata levy that is struck, we call it a strata levy that's raised for the purpose of carrying out emergency repair work, can be made payable within 14 days. So our law at the moment is if you're going to have regular quarterly levies, you've got to give people at least 30 days to pay those levies. If it's going to be for an emergency repair, and it doesn't matter how much it is, it could be a special levy that everyone has to contribute 10 grand, 20 grand. You can make that payable within 14 days because the work needs to be done urgently. The roof is leaking or whatever it is. That's something that when I'm talking to owners, they're getting a bit panicked about, saying, oh, hang on a second, I might not be able to access that money within 2 weeks.
Yeah, it's a bit shocking, I guess. You can understand why, as a strata manager, you're thinking, we need to get the roof sealed or whatever it is. The lift's not working. The lift is not working. It needs to be working so somebody on the 10th floor can get to their apartment. So you can understand why they would need funds quickly. But that is, I guess, a bit of a shock. Is there a provision there for hardship?
There is, in a way. There is an opportunity for owners to ask for a payment plan if they're finding it difficult to pay their levies, and they can ask the strata committee if they will consider a payment plan, and then it's up to the committee to decide whether they will agree to that or not and what the terms of that payment plan should be. There's also the opportunity for interest to be waived, and this is a really big one. Interest rates are through the roof for everybody, but particularly in strata, the interest rate is 10%, and that is a statutory rate that's in our legislation. So interest can soon rack up if you're not paying your levies on time. But there is a provision in the current legislation where owners can ask for interest to be waived on late levies, and essentially that is a form of payment plan because then you can pay over time and not have to worry about getting slugged with that 10%.
Because I did see some headlines, and I suspected they might have been slightly sensationalist, around people being forced to sell their apartments or townhouses or villas because they couldn't afford to pay their levies. I mean, is that a serious problem in some areas, or is that just, once again, it's one of those things where some people are suffering and it makes a good story?
Look, it is happening. It is happening out there. And I think we're hearing more about it just, I think, because of the nature of media, and it's easier for people to tell their stories. There's more interest these days in strata. As you said, Chris, more people are living in strata. But our buildings are getting old. These buildings were built in the 50s, 60s, 70s. They've gone well for 20 or 30 years. Sure, we have brand new buildings now with building defects, but those that were built years ago are generally pretty structurally sound. And for those first and second generation owners who bought off the developer and then maybe inherited it through their family, they haven't had to do anything to these buildings. And the law really hasn't required them to do anything to these buildings. So it's getting to the stage where these buildings are 40 and 50 years old, and the roof waterproof membrane has never been replaced. The lift has never been replaced. And it's all time now for this to happen. And we now have strict laws about common property needing to be repaired and maintained, about buildings not being able to avoid that obligation or delay that obligation. And the costs are incredibly high. They're high for everyone, construction, for any type of property, but particularly in strata. We have new legislation brought in by our building commissioner, David Chandler. Lots of media about the good work that he's been doing. It's great, and it's raising the quality of our construction, but that new legislation also applies to older buildings and applies to remedial work. And the standard of remedial work now has to be that much higher. So guess what? It's that much more expensive. So I see it in my own building. I see it with owners that I'm working with. Jobs that were once $500,000 for your roof and your windows are now $2 million. That's what these jobs are coming in at. And the building is getting a strata loan, or they're raising a special levy for owners to contribute to. Some owners cannot afford that. And there's no way out. There's no way out of that. If you can't afford to repair your building, you can't afford to own it.
So it's interesting. A client yesterday has been eyeing off an apartment in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. They're having a tough time buying. I mean, it's a tight budget, wanting to get a good asset, keep getting blown out by underpricing, underquoting, and going well over what their expectations are. Typical sort of buyer journey. And they don't want to pay for it, don't want to use a buyer's agent. That's okay. But, money is tight for them, to be honest. And there's an apartment they're running up in the east, and this thing's got a $200,000 special levy that is due. That's why they're selling it, right? This thing's a good asset. Like, it is great land, small block of units, good. Once it's repaired, it's absolutely a top asset. But it's like, even the 200's pretty vague. There's some really, they actually haven't got final quotes, haven't agreed, but it's all in the minutes and this is coming. Like, do you think this is what's obviously happened to the owner here, that they're not willing to do strata finance, which I think that's what he mentioned, and the owner of that, because everyone's saying we're not willing to do strata finance, has to raise their own money, which they can't, so they're having to sell? Is that sort of, what's happening most likely?
That could be it. Is this a $200,000 levy payable by just that one lot, or is it $200,000 spread across the whole building? For them. Just for them. So it is huge. Wow.
Yeah, because it's a small block of, brick buildings. But yeah, and I think there's waterproofing issues and all sorts going on.
Yeah.
But, it adds up, right? It's a big roof and it's a big,
Well, exactly. That's what I'm saying about these $2 million. I've seen $5 million rectification works projects. So what's happening there is that in order to raise this money, the decision has to be made at a general meeting. So that's a meeting to which all owners are entitled to attend and they all cast their votes. And what should happen in a functioning community is that there's options put to owners. We can, if we've got the money in the bank, then we can pay the fees out of the money that we've got. That'd be great. If we don't have the money in the bank, then we can raise a special levy, and that's a one-off payment that everybody has to pay. You go and borrow from your bank, or if you've got funds or whatever it is, draw down on your mortgage, you pay that in by a certain date, and maybe that's payable in installments as well. And then the third option is to go and get strata finance, a strata loan. And that's a unique financial product. There's only a few lenders out there in the market who'll do it. They essentially give you a loan. There's no security. There's no mortgage on your title. There's no mortgage on the common property. The security is that levies are then raised for years down the track to repay the interest and the principal on that loan. The interest rates on those loans, even compared to today's interest rates, are very high. So they're getting up to that 10 and 12% mark as well for those loans. So put those options to owners, and then owners vote on which option they want to go with. So it's sounding like in this building, and it's only a majority vote. So the majority who are attending that meeting have decided that they will pay that $200,000 out of their own pockets and not get a strata loan.
And that's an issue, isn't it? Because if you don't go to your meeting, or you're not aware of what's being proposed, you could have this impost, and I've heard the story many, many, many times about buyers who've bought a strata building and then a month later they get slapped with a special levy. They had no idea it was on the horizon because they don't know how to do their due diligence, or they didn't understand what was missing from the strata report or whatever.
Yep.
And it's like a lot of this stuff is discoverable even if you have to look for the hints. And often it is in the hints, which is unfortunate. But we've had these conversations before around, what's in the strata report. But it is interesting that, that this time period, so legislation included, what's included in this legislation is that shortening of the time period of when that's due and payable. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of interesting too because, Chris, you were talking about that experience, and I think about a small block. And obviously with a small block, and a lot of rhetoric in property investment circles is, it's a good idea to buy in a small block on a nice big parcel of land because land is where the value is. And this it's quite a simplistic way of looking at an asset. And because, of course, there are pros and cons with all of these things, you've got less people to share the cost with. We talk about that with our clients when we're looking at a small building, and we want to know, has that building got a good history of maintaining it and a consistent investment in their capital works fund and a consistent investment in maintaining the building? Because a lot of these older buildings were owned by, back in the 60s, people downsized. They sold the family home and downsized into an apartment, and then they're on a pension. Like they didn't have a lot of money to be contributing to sinking funds, or that's what they were previously known as. And then you had investors buy into them, and they didn't really want to be putting a lot of money in sinking funds either because that erodes their cash flow and their income from their investment. So you can see how there's a history in many of these buildings of a lack of investment in the general maintenance and upkeep of it. So I imagine this is really when it's all coming home to roost. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. It's this moment in time. What's pushing a lot of buildings to finally do work that they've put off for a long time as well is the insurers. The insurers now will not renew insurance policies. The premiums have gone sky high, or they'll only give them a short-term policy, 3 or 6 months. And they're saying, we will not give you a longer policy. We will not reinsure you until you get this work done. So what's happening is these buildings are saying, we don't have a choice. I mean, that, in my view as a lawyer, they've never had a choice. The law is you got to repair and maintain. But if nobody's suing them, then they take their sweet time. But now they can't get building insurance, and legally they must have building insurance. So this is the insurance industry as well, bolting on to these problems that Strata has, and insurance is hard to get in all sorts of sectors at the moment. But this is the impact that it's having in Strata.
We interviewed Karen Stiles a few weeks back, and she did raise that. And so this is good to be talking about, because I wondered, how did the insurance company come to understand that the building needs major work?
Yeah, there's a mandatory disclosure. You must disclose. Yeah, so the strata manager, who's the professional who's doing all the books and records and is filling in forms, when they go to get their quotes, and we get 3 quotes, try to get 3 quotes from insurers. A lot of buildings these days can't even get 1 quote, they just get one from their current insurer and that's it. You must fill in a form that requires you to disclose what's going on in the building. Is there any outstanding maintenance work? Are there orders from the tribunal to do work? Is there a claim by owners in the tribunal? And that disclosure is made, and that impacts your premium and indeed your ability to even get insurance.
If you can't get insurance, what happens?
Well, you've breached the law. You can seek an exemption, go to the tribunal and try and seek an exemption. But it's a very scary situation, I say, for a building. I've spoken to some strata managers who've actually gone to non-strata industry insurers, overseas insurers. I think eventually you will find somebody, but the question is, how much is it going to be? I've heard of buildings with $1 million premiums that are getting strata loans to pay their insurance premium.
My God.
Because that's all they can get.
So there's a definite impetus to actually then instead spend the money upgrading your building, but that's sort of, you got it coming from both directions there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's how big a problem is this, do you think?
It's a huge problem. It's absolutely a huge problem. And, you know, there is work being done in the insurance area to at least try and talk about these things. I've spoken to insurance experts on my podcast. John Trowbridge is one of them, who has done a report into insurance practices in the strata sector, looking at things like commissions and broker fees, and looking at the impact that those issues may have on rising premiums. But I mean, really, that's only part of the story, but it's one that we have been having in the strata space.
So what else is this legislation looking at?
Yeah, so you mentioned there, Veronica, the need for owners to be informed, to be going to their meetings. And I really echo that. And there is a recognition in our proposed new legislation that owners need more time before going to a meeting. They need more time to read the documents for the meeting. They need more time to understand the agenda. And so where we currently have a law that says meeting notices go out 7 days before the meeting, owners must have at least 7 days notice. The proposed change is that for annual general meetings, our AGMs that buildings must have at least once a year, the meeting documents go out 2 weeks before. And there's a bit of talk in the speech that was given to Parliament about how important those meetings are. Contracts are going to be renewed at those meetings for a strata manager, for a building manager. Levies are going to be raised, loans are going to be entered into, and owners are sometimes getting these notices the night before the meeting because they only need 7 days notice, and they're not reading it, they're not turning up to the meeting, and they're not engaging in that decision-making process. So I think that's a good thing that they have more time with their meeting agendas. It does put a burden on our strata managers who are sending these documents out. You're now going to have to be planning your meetings 6 weeks in advance because you've got to have 2 weeks with the documents in the owner's hands, and it takes 2 weeks to get something through the mail these days. So
Yes.
more of an administrative burden there for our managers.
Well, it doesn't everyone on email. I mean, my goodness. I'm interested to, on that, because I know that there's something in there about digital record keeping.
Yeah.
Now, I'm really astounded every time we get a strata report for a property we're looking at buying for a client, even myself in the strata property I own in. I mean, seriously, why can't, in this modern day and age, why can't I have a portal that we can log into? We can easily get the minutes. We can work out when the next meeting's on. I'm astounded that that as running a business, there's not more appetite for this. Why does it need to be legislated? But can you fill us in on I guess, what's happening in this particular space, and why did it even need to be, one of the 139 points, really?
Yeah. So what the change is, again, one that I support, as you do, Veronica, owners corporations, the body corporates must keep their records in electronic form. So that's never been said before, it's never been legislated before. And yes, there were plenty of buildings and managed buildings. So buildings that have a professional strata manager that still had paper documents, and you couldn't log into a portal and look at things. And I am just as frustrated as you are by that. Look, strata management is and has been for a long time stuck in the dark ages. Strata managers were born of real estate agents. The real estate agent had the rent roll and then had the strata portfolio as well on the side. And it was just a little side thing that they did to get a bit of extra monthly recurring revenue into their business. It was never, for a long time, was not a separate profession. It's certainly not something that young people come out of university saying, I want to be a strata manager, or out of school saying, I want to be a strata manager. So it's been an industry that's been ripe for disruption for a long time. There's not a lot of people doing a lot of creative things in this space. And that's why we have to have legislation that's kind of forcing these stragglers, plenty of very professional strata management companies out there, but there are stragglers out there, forcing them into the real world. And going to have to keep everything electronically.
Amanda, is there anything changing with like new builds and the future builds and the conflicts around selecting strata managers? And, even just on the SMH today, there's 3,000 apartments in Macquarie Park. Men's is on a bit of a mission to rezone and, some high density hotspots and, the approval buttons getting hit. Like, are we at a good opportunity now before the next wave of developments to change legislation to better protect future owners and renters?
Yeah, so, the big discussion in the new build space has been building defects, and for a long time has been building defects, and what protections do we have in place for those who are buying off the plan to make sure that they're buying into quality. And a lot of good work's been done there by David Chandler, and it does tie into this electronic documents and records discussion, because what he's done is develop new legislation where everything has to be lodged through an electronic portal and through an electronic platform. So all of the plans for the buildings, all of the diagrams, all of the construction drawings, all of the as-built plans, they all now for new buildings are going to be electronic. And that really helps owners to understand, A, what they're buying, and B, when something goes wrong, how should it have been built? What was the original plan? And I was just talking to an owner today. Her new building missed that boat, and so they don't have the electronic plans, and she's gone to council, and all they've got are the architectural drawings. So she doesn't even know if what she's looking at is what was legally approved by council. So there's been work in that space in New South Wales to bring all of that up to scratch. So at the press of a button, you should be able to have what Chandler calls this single source of truth. How is it that the building was supposed to be built? The Strata Hub is working towards that direction as well. So that's something we have in New South Wales, where there is every year a building has to report certain information to the Office of Fair Trading, and that gets recorded on what we're calling the Strata Hub. And that's information like, who are your committee members? What are their names and their contact details? Who is your strata manager? Who is your building manager? Do you have a bylaw about pets? We're working towards reporting what's the balance of your capital works fund. So actual buildings actually having to report how much money they've got set aside. That information is being reported, but it's not being made public at the moment.
What about a copy of the Capital Works Fund forecast?
Yep.
Not that all of them are worth more than the paper they're written on, but we know that buildings have to get it for starters, and they have to review it. It has to be revised every 5 years. I think that's correct.
You got it. Yeah.
I see a lot of buildings that got one done 12 years ago and have never had a revision. So that should be a no-brainer, I would think. Because, just to compare what their balance is versus what's recommended, and is it up to date? There's sort of a couple of things that we look at whenever we're looking at, they're just tip of the iceberg really, but a few of the many things that we look at. There's also a new strata commissioner. Now, I was going to talk to you about that at the end of this. once we've gone through all the legislation, but it's probably a good time to mention it, really, given that there's change on this side. And obviously the building commissioner, David Chandler, has been so effective on the defect side of things. What is the new strata commissioner what's his mandate? What's his job description?
That's a good question.
John Minns, right?
His name is John Minns. Yes, he was the Property Services Commissioner and has now up-leveled to become both the Strata and Property Services Commissioner. So we didn't get a distinct separate role, which I think some people were a bit disappointed about, someone who was solely devoted to strata. It's something that we've really been begging for in New South Wales for quite some time. But I know John, and that is a question that I will be asking him on my podcast in a few weeks' time when we have a chat. Look, I think it was an election promise by Chris Minns, and no relation to John Minns, by the way, just coincidence that they have the same last name. And we're happy to see that come through. The New South Wales legislative reform, I think will be the main thing that's on his agenda, and consulting with owners and with industry about how we can improve our legislation. I know the last time I had an off-the-record chat with him, I was really focused on this repair and maintenance issue. When he asked me what the big challenge was, I said it's these aging buildings and it's these owners who are suffering with these $2 million bills. And that's why you're seeing media reports about people having to sell or being bankrupted. So a lot of media as well about bankruptcies, and whatever the figure was, 5% of all bankruptcies are unpaid strata levies. That's a dirty mark on our industry. And if that's what's happening, then that needs to be looked at more closely as well, why that's happening. So I think he's got a long list.
I'm on a personal mission to help more people make better property decisions. And you can find out all about what I'm working on at veronicamorgan.com.au. And there you'll find resources for first home buyers, details about my buyer's agent mentoring program, access to suburb help for investors, or if you're looking to buy your dream home or an investment property in Sydney's inner west, eastern suburbs or lower North Shore, you can connect with my team at Good Deeds Property Buyers.
If you're thinking about buying your first home, upgrading to a new one, or purchasing an investment property anywhere in Australia, we would love to carefully guide you through this journey and importantly get the finance right. Please reach out via our website, wealthful.com.au.
Don't forget that you can download our free full or forecaster report. Which experts can you trust to get it right? theelephantintheroom.com.au.
Yes. Okay, well, good. Well, I shall wait for that interview of yours, and maybe we should try and get him on here too. I want to talk to you about a few other things about, real estate licenses and stuff like that.
Yes, that's him. He's your man.
That's a totally different topic. He's the man.
Yeah.
All right. So what else? What else is on the list, the hit list in these this legislation?
If anyone has been on a strata committee before, or maybe had a run-in with their strata committee, may understand the conflict that can bring, the emotion around that. And sometimes owners want to get rid of their strata committee members, not bump them off completely, but to actually remove them from their positions. And when they come to me and say, Amanda, how do we do that? Is there a legal way to do that? I say, oh, look, it's really hard to do. You have to pass a special resolution at a general meeting, which is a super majority. You have to get voting in favour of kicking the strata committee out, or you have to get an order of the tribunal. And I can tell you, I have never seen the tribunal make that order. Well, there's been a lot of talk about people having trouble, obviously, with their strata committees. And so what the new legislation says is that a strata committee member can be removed from their office with a simple majority resolution at a general meeting. So you only need just a little bit more than 50% of people to put their hand up and say, yeah, we think Bob is doing a bad job. He's conflicted. He's self-interested. He's paying himself out of our trust account. He's got to go. You can achieve that with a majority resolution. And also, Bob can't be on the committee for 1 year. So he's suspended for a year, can't get back on. That's when I saw that, I went, oh, that's exciting. I'm often asked by owners, how do we get rid of our committee members and make sure they can never serve on the committee again? And I say, yeah, well, you can't do that. Well, now you can suspend them for a year.
After a year, depending on how dogged they are, they may try to get back on it again. But I guess you've got time to garner support from others and
it.
Perhaps block that.
Have a regime change.
Yeah. It's an interesting one, but also I noticed that there's actually, because in a normal strata building, right, in New South Wales anyway, you can have maximum 9 committee members, correct?
Yep, that's it.
But community title and those bigger complexes, they are a whole nother level. I mean, I saw one complex once with 17 different strata managers as part of it, strata schemes, get my terminology right. 17 strata schemes as part of one giant complex. Like, what a behemoth. Yeah, behemoth, is that how you say it? And then you'll have a couple of different management committees within that, right? So there's some changes to how many can be on that, I understand.
Yes. So you're absolutely right. We have huge communities like that. In Sydney, I think of Jackson's Landing, which has got, in Pyrmont, which has got 22 subsidiary schemes, we call them, whether they're strata buildings or other types of developments. Breakfast Point is another big one. So they have community associations is the overarching body that governs all of those subsidiaries. And the community association has an executive committee. And that executive committee has been limited to 9 representatives, which makes no sense when you've got these other buildings. You might have 20 other buildings and they should all have a say. They should all be represented. So what's proposed, this is an amendment to the community schemes legislation. When the legislation goes through, we'll be able to have 15 members on a community association committee, which is great. More voices being heard, more representation, but again, a huge administrative task for those who are convening meetings, who are writing minutes, who are notifying committee members. To deal with 15 committee members, that's going to be a whole lot of fun for our strata and community managers.
So there's pros and cons, but like if you've got 20 subsidiary, subsidiary bodies, 22, then you can have maximum 15 representatives. So there's still 7 that's going to miss out.
Yep.
And then it's pretty unwieldy having 15 committee members. Yeah. So it's an interesting one.
And just a reminder to anyone who's listening who sort of is not as au fait with the strata world as we are, these are people who are serving on these committees, who are running these places. These are people, everyday people who have no special skills, no experience, no qualifications, no training. Yes, they might employ a professional strata manager or building manager, and they absolutely should. But otherwise, they are managing multi-million-dollar budgets in some cases. And they're doing that at night at 11 p.m. when they log into their email account, answer their emails with a glass of wine in their hand, and try not to defame anybody when they're replying to emails. And they're volunteers. Yeah. So it's a big ask. It's a really big ask. And our buildings are getting more complex. That more burdens are then being placed on owners who are hands-on on their committees. And that could be another reason why, the cracks literally are starting to show.
There's a bit of a rhetoric story going around that investors are, due to legislation change, more tenant-friendly laws, etc., that, it doesn't make sense to buy investment properties, right? Like that's one of the reasons we're having a rental crisis, that it's legislation change or it's consistent legislation change that's pro-tenant. What's your take on that in the strata world? Do you think that, that investors need to be more careful with the building they're buying into, that these tenant laws are making it harder for them, or is it really just an easy way out?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I have thought about this a bit recently. I was talking on my Facebook page and also on my own podcast about some successful tenant claims against landlords in strata. And this is part of this perfect storm of events, of course, is that if you've got a leaky building and it becomes wet, your unit becomes wet, moldy, wet carpet, water's coming through the balcony doors, coming through the roof, whatever, your tenant is going to start complaining about that and say, hang on a second, I have rights as a tenant to live in a dry, safe place that's free of mold. That's not happening. I want a rent reduction, or I'm going to break my lease, or I'm just not going to pay rent because this place is uninhabitable. So that's a claim that the tenant makes against the landlord. That has nothing to do, that claim has nothing to do with strata. However, in these cases that are going before the tenancy tribunal, the landlords are saying, well, there's nothing we can do about it because we're waiting for strata to fix it. We're waiting for the owners corporation to raise this $2 million levy. We're waiting for owners to pay it. They won't do it. So there's nothing I can do about it. I'm doing the best I can. tenancy tribunal says, we don't care what Strata's doing or not doing, not our problem. You've got a contract, a lease with your tenant. You're obliged to meet these legal obligations. So tenants are being awarded. One case that I looked at a couple of weeks ago, tenant was awarded $14,000 as a retrospective rent reduction. Landlord had to pay that. Now, what most landlords don't know is that you can actually claim your losses. You're an owner, you're a landlord, you can claim your losses from the owner's corporation. So where you have lost money because of a failure to repair and maintain the common property, you can claim that from the owner's corporation. So what we're seeing is part of a landlord's loss is now lost rent or rent reductions or other claims by tenants for damaged goods. Those landlords can then claim against the owner's corporation. So these buildings, not only do they have to spend the money fixing the problem, they may also be paying out damages claims brought by landlords who have suffered from their tenants' claims. I'm not sure what the answer to your question is, but landlords absolutely need to be across all of this, but they do have rights. They have some fairly entrenched rights to be able to make those claims. Tenants are becoming more savvy and more aware of their rights as well. But in the strata context, I mean, aside from that, they're really not, they don't have a voice at a meeting or the ability to really affect any change at the owner's corporation level.
It's interesting because it does take quite a while to get to the cause of often water leaks, and then to work out what the problem is, what's the solution, raise the money, find the right contractors to do the work, book it in, do it, etc., especially in an environment of rising costs and a shortage of labour. So there's sort of like this situation that in a way is stacked against a quick resolution, despite the fact you might be able to soon get your money through special levies in 14 days. Being able to actually spend that money in a timely fashion is another challenge, right? So I guess it's just a reflection and cause for pause, if we like, and to understand some of the challenges of living in strata and owning in strata. And I think too, certainly when we're looking at evaluating a building to purchase into, we are trying to work out, does history give us red flags and give us some warnings? And you're looking at not only history of the maintenance, as I mentioned earlier, you want to see a history of them actually looking after their asset, but you also want a history of how do they deal with things when they come up. So some buildings, you can see very clearly they have a history of raising special levies, which says to me that they don't necessarily plan things. And you see other buildings that are run like corporations, and they've got strategic plans, they've got the whole gamut, right? And you think, yes, I get so much confidence in reading those sort of strata reports. And it comes back to what you're talking about before. You've got committees that are not experts in this space. They're not experts in building management or just buildings generally quite often. And obviously strata, bigger buildings require, they're more complex. So, and then you've got a strata industry that I guess hasn't necessarily been trained in these specific areas either. So you've got, and they're not necessarily paid accordingly to be able to provide that advice. So you've got this sort of big asset, big expensive, valuable and potentially costly asset, and the people making decisions aren't necessarily the best equipped to be driving the agenda, right? So having said all that, how does somebody, does this new legislation help take that in further in the direction of making this better? Or in an environment of rising costs, I mean, does the real solution lie in actually upskilling strata managers more, and therefore they can charge more? And who's going to want to pay?
Yeah, look, I think that is a big part of it, upskilling strata managers, and we as an industry have been saying that for a long time. We're told that there's steps in that direction for strata managers to become more professional. John Minns can talk to you about the licensing changes that have happened and more focus on more quality professional development and training for our strata managers. But that's just a small part or one component of what you've articulated there, Veronica, is a big, wide-ranging problem. And often the people who are left to make decisions about how to spend money and how to fix a building are the last the last men standing at the AGM who get picked on to be on the committee, or they've been on the committee for many, many years and the only ones who are willing to put their hand up, or there might be new owners who don't really know what they're getting into. So that's a worry as well. I mean, some people say, I've heard some people say what we need is a structure far more corporatized, as you say, where there are professional full-time committee members who come in and get appointed to a building and then make that decision as you do if you were paid to sit on a board. Make those decisions with all expertise and qualification. That is what strata managers were intended to be, essentially. I mean, they're not decision makers. They are there to guide and to advise. Ultimately, the building makes the decision. But, it's something that I've said, I don't think that will ever happen, that buildings, because they're people's homes, that the government would ever legislate for there to be a professional paid to sit on your committees and make those decisions. But I can see the value in that. I really can.
Yeah. It's a tough one though, isn't it? Like anything, you got to pay for it. And we don't like to pay for things we've never had to pay for before. So you're paying one way or the other. If you don't pay through dollars, you're going to be paying through inconvenience or dollars otherwise.
Yeah, time.
Yeah.
Amanda, do you advise your clients to, when they're buying into strata buildings, to do their own building and pest? Like, I mean, often people look at the strata report and they'll go there, but do you think that, with all these new legislations, with all these building issues that are, you're best to actually just try to, look ahead and see if you can spot things that could be an issue and pay for outside help that, they can see warning signs because they've seen lots of apartment buildings and go, look, it's not on the strata report yet, it's not on the minutes, but I just know these type of buildings are going to have these problems and at some point, and maybe it's 5-10 years down the road, and this one looks like, as it's getting closer to that point. Like, is it worth investing that money in? Because a lot of people just bypass that building and pest for apartments, right? They look at the strata, they look at the minutes, it all looks fine, it's well maintained, let's just go ahead. But it's getting more and more risky, right? So
yeah, definitely.
What's your thoughts?
Look, it's something that I absolutely would encourage new homeowners to, those looking at purchasing in strata to do. I don't do any conveyancing anymore, but if I'm asked that question, yes, do your strata inspection of the books and records, but also do that building and pest. Why? Because I then work with clients on the other end who have bought this nice shiny new apartment. It could be riddled with building defects that weren't otherwise identified anywhere else, but it could be an older building where there's been a bathroom renovation done. And the minute you do a bathroom renovation and you change the original waterproofing, the original tiles, that area is no longer the responsibility of the owner's corporation. You've interfered with it, right? So there might be a renovation that's been done and it's not on the records and there's no bylaw that gives approval for that renovation. And then you buy in, a few months later, there's a leak and it's a leak from your bathroom to downstairs. And you didn't know about it. The owner's you think, oh, well, it's common property. It's a waterproof membrane. The owner's corporation should be responsible for that. They send someone in. They say, hang on a sec, this is a new bathroom. This was done 3 years ago. It was a dodgy job done by that contractor. We're not going to touch it. Now, that's something that might be able to be revealed if you have a builder going in there who knows what they're doing and has a look at the joint before you buy. So for that reason, I think it's a great exercise to do.
We've got we're looking at a property at the moment for a client and a little bit similar. It's like we can see that when it was last sold, it had one bathroom and now it's got two. It's been split in two. One's become an ensuite. Great, very sensible. I'd love to do it myself. I think that's a really good thing to do. So then you go, look, where's the bylaw? Oh, there's none. Go to the agent. Just wondering if the owner can provide any evidence that they got this approved through Strata before doing it. Oh, no, the owner is the chair of the owners' corporation, so he would have done it by the book.
Absolutely. They're the ones that always do it by the book, aren't they?
I know. And I'm going, that's fabulous, because when they sell, I'm presuming they're not going to be the chair anymore, and I'm presuming that they won't retrospectively be able to approve it. So, it's just like, that makes it even worse, just quietly.
Yeah.
But it's quite common, and it's one of the things, like flooring is another one that if you've got timber flooring down and there's no approval for that, it's like, okay, I don't want to be buying that one.
Yeah, exactly. If you've got the right people advising you, you can sort that out before you sign the contract, because you can put a term in the contract that requires the owner, the vendor, to sort all of that out before settlement. And that's, you can make your settlement conditional upon the bylaw being in place or the flooring being approved. There's an easy way to solve that. But if you sign that contract on the auction day or, without going and talking to someone who knows something about strata, you're going to miss that opportunity.
That's exactly right. So, yeah, the building and pest inspection might help with that. The challenge with building and pest inspections on strata buildings is that if they're small enough, if they're small buildings, particularly like an Art Deco building or something like that, they often got timber floors, they were built on stumps, like you can go out there and a builder can, even though they've only got access to one lot, they can see enough of the rest of the building to get a good sense of where problems may lie. But in a larger complex, where they've only got access to one lot, it's very limited, and also a multi-level complex, it's quite difficult for a building inspector to be able to give much, over and above. I mean, there was one particular building that we looked at some years ago where there was the garages were in a separate building to the rest. In fact, I've had this twice. The garages were in a separate structure to the apartment building. Those old red brickers with the separate garages. And in both cases, there was concrete cancer in the roof. One was sort of manageable and, we got some estimates in terms of could see whether they were on top of it, et cetera, and were satisfied that it was worthwhile going ahead. With the other one, the inspector said something along the lines of, and I paraphrase, "I'm surprised this garage building hasn't slid down the cliff yet." So,
but it will.
With nothing to do with concrete cancer, of course. But, you just think, oh, there's... glad we got that building inspection. So there are definitely times when it's worthwhile.
Yeah, it's a good tip.
Didn't buy that property. Yeah, did not buy that property.
Property dumbo for us, Amanda. I'm sure there's been another one
Property
popping up
dumbo.
recently.
All right, we need to lighten the mood a bit because I feel like, we chat about strata a fair bit, and I like to eventually come around to, look, it's not all doom and gloom, and there's good stuff there too, and I still think people should buy and invest in strata. Anyway, that's not where I'm going today, unfortunately. But I do want to share an amusing story. I do a bit of education with strata managers, and I talk about renovation work and what do you do when an owner does work illegally. They don't get approval before they do the bathroom renovation, or they just start building something in the back courtyard. What are your options? And in delivering some of this education a few months ago, I stumbled across a case where an owner had decided that he wanted a bit of entertainment during lockdown. So this was a 2020 case, and he had his kids staying with him. They were bored. They're not at school. We're in the middle of the homeschooling. And he decided that he had a nice courtyard area that was connected to the common area as well. And he built in that area a skate ramp. Built a skate ramp. And no permission, no approval, didn't bother to chat to anyone about it before he did. And ultimately, the committee asked him, sorry, don't really want a skate ramp in our back courtyard. Can you remove it? He didn't. And he ended up in the tribunal. And what he said to the tribunal was, but everybody can enjoy it. It's there. It's accessible. I've made the area really nice. I'm a bit of a landscaper by trade. I've done some nice gardens. It's lovely. It's so much better than it was. And everyone saw me doing it. They were walking past every day. They didn't tell me to stop. They didn't have any issue with it. And ultimately, the tribunal said, too bad, so sad. You don't have approval for your skate ramp or your lovely new garden bed. It's all got to come down and come out. And by the way, you're also going to get fined $500 for breaching the bylaws. So, that's where that one ended up. The poor sir, during lockdown, and his kids had to pack up their skateboards.
The noise must have been so irritating. I could just imagine you're stuck at home all day. Everyone else in the block stuck in there all day, and the kids are out there with that skateboarding noise.
But it is just
very
amazing.
Pretty to look at, aren't they?
It's amazing what people think. Yeah.
Yeah. I love that idea but people saw me doing it. It's like, people are scared to speak. So when somebody's so brazen, they're like, oh, I just don't even know what to say to them.
And this is the thing about strata. These people are your neighbours. They're the people who you see every day. It's not like some corporate nobody dispute that you might have where it's all just paperwork and lawyers and phone calls. No, you're actually, at the end of the day, you're going home and you're walking past that person. You're parking your car next to them. You're having to sit next to them in a meeting. And this is why the conflict is so much more difficult to resolve. And that's also part of the reason why I love strata law.
Because you like resolving conflicts or you like complications?
I like the complications. I like the interesting people. And I like that in order to be a good lawyer, you've got to be across that. You've got to be in tune with that. You've got to understand. I'm often talking to owners and I'm saying, okay, so I hear that it was, they've breached this bylaw about the parking, but what's really going on here? And then you find out that somebody didn't invite somebody else to the Christmas party, and then they brought the wrong bottle of wine, and then this one asked his wife on a date, and then she got upset and whatever it is. And I love it.
So it's strata therapy. I often say what we do is property therapy. Sounds like you're on the same sort of slightly more fraught.
You got to be.
It reminds me of a story of a client, actually. It was like a couple of years ago in Melbourne, and they had like a communal garden in the centre of an apartment block. And, he wanted to basically tidy it up and make it a bit nicer and plant some plants in there, and all the others in the apartments in that communal area on the ground floor were like, yeah, go for it. We're all for it. But he didn't get all the other ones above didn't sort of approve it. And so he slugged himself out for a weekend, made it all nice, made it way better. He covered all the costs, it was, he did it quite cheaply.
This might be the same guy we're talking about.
Yeah, and then he done it, and then they said, we don't like it, take it back to how it was.
Yeah, that's what happens. It happens.
And he was like, well, everyone agreed, but he got everyone on the ground floor agreed, and everyone liked it, on the ground floor, but the people above said, oh, we don't like looking at that, he didn't speak to us, and he was like, oh, I didn't think of that.
See, common sense is not the law. That's what you have to remember. The property dumbos out there, common sense is not the way it goes. You think it should work that way.
Common sense isn't that common either.
And there's that too. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Great
My
chat.
pleasure. Thank you. Always fun.
Always fun. We do have a number of other episodes where Amanda has come along and spoken to us. We'll put them in the show notes. So if you want to hear more from Amanda, then check the show notes for those episodes.
If you have a question that you'd like us to answer in an upcoming Q&A episode, you can send us a voicemail or written question via the website, theelephantintheroom.com.au, or you can email us directly at questions@theelephantintheroom.com.au. If you like what you're hearing, please share this episode with others you feel would benefit. And while you're at it, why not leave us an iTunes review? 5 stars would be great. I know that sounds a bit cringy, but we have it on good authority that every review helps make it easier for other people to find out about us and hear what our amazing guests have to say.